Chapter 8. How should we organise society? Many people like to think that the system can be reformed, that we can redistribute wealth, or write fairer laws, or adopt clever new green technologies, or create new kinds of institution. It should be obvious by now that this is impossible. Because every part of the system is connected to every other part, the whole thing is threatened by any kind of piecemeal change. Just consider, by way of one example, what it would mean to meaningfully reform schooling, so that children could learn their culture in the manner they have learnt it for hundreds of thousands of years, by directly participating in it. In order for this to work, everything would have to change. All of society would have to become educational. It would have to become a place that children can learn from, rather than a place that they can do nothing but passively observe. And when I say educational, I mean meaningfully educational, allowing children to discover who they are, rather than forcing them to do what the system requires. What's more, all the system-made distractions and addictions, which would instantly absorb the attention of children allowed to live freely, would also have to be removed from their lives. All of this would now mean the total disintegration of every aspect of the system. Similar considerations prevent us from ever taking any of our technologies a step back. Consider what it would mean to return to horse-drawn carriages, or to coal-burning heating systems, or to paper or tape-based information and filing systems. Again, everything would have to change. Only forward makes sense to the technological system. Only more. Only bigger. Less, backwards and smaller are as inconceivable to machines and to mechanised minds and systems as different is, or better. This is why we haven't been able to reverse the direction of any of the disastrous developments of the past century. How much progress have we made dealing with the problems of nuclear weapons, the emptying of the oceans, the erosion of topsoil, overpopulation, genetic engineering, the proliferation of microplastics and other pollutants, widespread madness, addiction, anxiety, depression, etc., the death of culture, the abolition of gender, generalised incompetence, outrageous inequality, corruption, or the exploitation of the poor? None. Even if one of these things could be effectively dealt with within, say, 100 years, which is very unlikely, dealing with any one of them throws the whole system into disarray, which is why defenders of the system simply will not allow any aspect of the system to meaningfully change, even if it could. One of the most ridiculous beliefs, which is extremely widespread, is that it is possible to vote our way out of the predicament we are in, that we need something called democracy. Everyone knows that we don't have democracy, but it should be obvious by now that it wouldn't matter if we did. If we actually had a choice about who makes our laws, these laws would still have to serve the system. A democratically elected government can soften the blow of the machine, just as a decent slave owner can keep his slaves well fed. But they remain slaves. In fact, they are more enslaved by comfort and charity than by overt brutality. Democracy works by forcing a minority to do what a majority tells it to do, which means that individual consciousness is either devalued or it's coerced. In fact, democracy does away with individual consciousness. This is why democratic societies are so irresponsible, because nobody has to take responsibility when decisions are made by a majority. Who is actually taking responsibility for the death of culture, the death of nature, the death of humankind? Who? Nobody, because nobody has to. Science today fulfills the same task. One of its chief goals is to explain our lives away, to show that our thoughts, actions and feelings are the result of our genes, or of hormones, or of some kind of disease, or some other physical cause. The reason why every discovery of such a cause is celebrated is because we are not allowed to be free. We must believe that we cannot help doing what we do or being what we are, that we are irresponsible. None of this is to say that autocratic monarchs and superstitious priests are any better than democratic statesmen and rational scientists. In fact, there's really no difference between them. There is really no difference between the owners of the machine, the kings and billionaires of the world, and its managers, the priests and professionals. We call the beliefs of the owners right-wing, and we call the beliefs of managers left-wing, but they all serve the machine, which is why the machine always wins. Chapter 9. How did the world begin? Once upon a time, human consciousness was free, human life was meaningful, and human society was fair. What happened? Earlier I said that the first human tool was the mind, the ability to isolate things, represent them as ideas, and rationally think about those ideas. The human mind seems to have assumed its current form hundreds of thousands of years ago. It's impossible to pinpoint quite when. Some say it appeared as recently as 60,000 years ago, some 10 times that. But whenever it evolved, it gave human beings the ability to rationally, I mean literally, isolate objects, name them, think about them, and literally talk about them, which gave us almost immeasurably more power, and therefore more responsibility, than any other animal on Earth. To start with, and for a very long time, this doesn't seem to have made much difference to our relationship to nature. Our cultural life became richer, and our societies slowly became more complex. But we remained embedded in nature. All the evidence we have shows that before 10,000 BC, there was no systematic warfare, no significant inequality, no misery, and very little ill health or disease. There was great pain and uncertainty, but that's life. No one minds these things if they live well, and people did live well. All that changed with the arrival of civilization, the world as we know it. First, around 10,000 BC, there was a long kind of interim period when hunter-gatherer societies became quite large and began experimenting with horticulture. This gave way to civilization as we normally understand it. Hierarchical agricultural states controlled by bureaucrats and princes and run by slaves, a now widely acknowledged disaster in human experience. By 3000 BC, civilized lifespans had dramatically fallen, warfare was constant, inequality was ruining lives, and nature was being systematically exploited. Debt-peonage, taxation, prostitution, ill health, wretched toil, iniquitous hierarchy, alienation, specialist professionals, slavery, deforestation, soil erosion, repression of minorities, violent subjugation of women, children and outsiders, and rank insanity. All of this was new to human experience. What had happened was the tool of the mind had grown beyond its limits. The thinking, wanting self, the onboard computer that we are so proud of, had stopped serving man and, like all tools which get out of hand, had started dominating him. Man no longer saw the world and the self from the inside, through the quality of his consciousness, but from without, as a collection of things. Things, remember, caused facts, are limited, and they are separate from other things. What this means, as we've seen, is that when man started to see reality through the screen of his thing-making self, his mortal, isolated, quality-immune self, he started to become existentially afraid, existentially alone, and existentially uncertain. This was completely new to human experience. The existential fear and unhappiness of the new thing-making self is completely unnatural. Animals naturally have fear in dangerous situations, and if they are social animals, they are attracted to their fellows, and they languish if they are separated from them. The self in charge of man, however, was not afraid of danger, or unhappy about missing his fellows. He was afraid of existence itself. and he was unhappy because he was cut off from existence. This is why we say that his fear, aloneness, and unhappiness were existential. They penetrated and sickened his very existence. This is why unnatural man, selfish man, is the only animal which always looks afraid and unhappy. So awful is existential fear and unhappiness that the self will do anything it can to keep them away. Its principal substitutes are permanence, prestige, thought, mindless activity, power, possession, and pain-killing. The self seeks to live forever, in renown, or in magic, technological or otherwise. It seeks to acquire fame, institutional power, or the power of knowledge, and it seeks to surround itself with objects, particularly those which have value, or which seem to offer some kind of security. The self also seeks to huddle together with other selves. This is not the conviviality of social creatures, but existential fear at facing the pain of one's own miserable mortal being cut off from existence. Self seeks to obliterate any kind of pain from its life, any kind of criticism, any kind of discomfort, any kind of shock or uncertainty, anything at all which feels, to the self, unpleasant. It will take drugs, lose itself in sex or in the constant prowling search for it, and it will work non-stop, even at moronic tasks, rather than stop and face the music. But the favourite tactic of the self, fleeing from the agony of its own fear and unhappiness, is thinking, 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 thinking. We can see selves start to operate like this at the beginning of civilization. Selves started to thirst for power, for pain-muffling narcotics, for celebrity status, for the reassuring warmth of the herd, and for all the other sops we are now so familiar with. They also started building the first machines and institutions. Their technology was rudimentary, so these were very weak and were constantly crumbling. But the huge organisational structures that, say, built the pyramids, were hyper-complex tools in the same way as our transport systems are. Finally, they created religions to justify all this. The religions of the Mesopotamians, the Egyptians, the Chinese, the Jews, the Greeks and the Romans were, despite inspired exceptions, fundamentally a means of justifying life in a miserable machine world. Chapter 10. What is religion? The word religion has many meanings, some of which are contradictory. Sometimes, when people say religion, they are talking about an institution, a large worldly organisation, like the Christian Church. Sometimes the word religion refers to the teachings of certain influential people. Some of these are decidedly worldly and very easy to understand by the mind, but some of them, the most beautiful, express the truth indirectly, enigmatically, or paradoxically. I'll give you a few examples. The way everlasting is the nameless uncarved wood. Lao Tzu. Split a piece of wood, and I am there. Lift up a stone, and you will find me there. Jesus of Nazareth. All know that the drop merges into the ocean, but few know that the ocean merges into the drop. Kabir Das. The lives and teachings of the most truthful religious teachers were supreme works of art expressing enigmatic quality, while those of second-rate teachers and priests are more like works of pseudo-scientific self-help. Such teachers and priests may have a feeling for the truth, but they are not conscious of it, which is why they are so keen to create ideologies and institutions, like Muhammad's Islam or Paul's Christian Church. Unconscious teachers and priests are not interested in free individuals experiencing the truth. They prefer people to believe in things. Belief means not to know. It's a kind of hope. If I tell you that I'm wearing green underpants, all you can ever really do is believe that I am, based on trust or faith. It's just another thing. Only this thing need not be something that can ever be factually real to you, like the onion can. Second-rate teachers and priests are always talking about trust, faith and belief, because they want you to come through them to the truth. They have the knowledge that you need to be happy. They've read the big books. They've been ordained. They have the qualifications, not you. Second-rate teachers and priests are also very keen to create and maintain rituals, ways of saying and doing things which they say show you are a good believer, but which actually show you belong to the religious group or society, and that shape you into a manner so that you can. If you go it alone, if you start thinking for yourself, if you start questioning beliefs and refusing rituals, you become a bad believer. Then you need to be punished, or you need some kind of therapy. Therapists, in fact, are priests. Their job is to return you to what is called the normal world, the rituals and beliefs that we all share and that keeps our society going. So what are these beliefs and myths for us today? Well, there are many of them, but here are a few important ones. One is that learning comes from schooled education, that you must go through 10 or 20 years of being forced to learn what the world tells you is important in order to get a qualification that allows you to participate in that world. Another one is that health comes from medicine, that human beings are essentially a walking, talking bundle of symptoms which they need the medical profession to keep at an acceptable level. Another modern myth, rather more subtle than these but much more important, is that there is an extremely important objective good thing called life, which is opposed to an evil thing called death, and which must be saved or preserved at all costs. Another myth, which we've already looked at, is that science can arrive at the truth, that we can live entirely in a rational universe of things governed entirely by literal causal laws. We are told to trust the science, because we are taught that knowing things and knowing the causal relation between things means that you can tell the difference between right and wrong. Another myth is that the past was bad and that the future is good, and that what we call progress is a journey from the bad old past to the good new future. This myth has it that more and bigger are always better than less and smaller. One myth, which is very important to those who own and manage the machine of the world, is that people are basically untrustworthy. They require discipline, coercion and force to make sure that they don't go off the rails. Another important myth today is that gender and even sex are illusions, that there is no essential difference between male bodies and female bodies. This myth justifies a world in which gendered domain and sexed bodies are really of no use. Another myth is the idea that there is something called mental illness, that our problems, which are very real, are biomedical diseases which require professional intervention to deal with. This myth is important because it lets the world, and the individual, off the hook. And so on. If you want to know what the myths of the world are, just turn on the news or listen to ordinary people have an ordinary conversation. You'll get the gist. Or you can pay attention to things which cannot be said or criticised. A few hundred years ago, it was impossible to say that God does not exist, or that the king is evil. This is because priests and princes ruled the world, and such ideas threatened their power. Today, it is impossible to say, or to act upon the idea, that some societies are worse than others, or that men and women are different, or that mental illness is a myth, or that it's okay for people to die, or any other idea that threatens the machine today. If you express these ideas, you'll soon find a nice, kind, caring professional turning up in your life, or you'll find the machine starts to exclude you from its nice, kind care. It's important to understand, though, that none of this happens consciously. None of the system's myths, for example, need to be explicitly taught. Of course they are taught, that's what school is for, and all the television programmes and books and websites, but they don't need to be, because people automatically think this way. As we've seen, we are born into the machine of the world, we are shaped by it from birth, our senses are filled with it, our way of life dictated by its needs. We are machine people, so we automatically think and perceive like machine people. I'm not just talking about the content of thought and perception and emotion, but the act of thinking, perceiving and emoting. Not just what we see on the screen, but that we are experiencing a representation. It's relatively easy to deal with stupid thoughts or mistaken perceptions or unpleasant feelings. You can just replace them with other thoughts, perceptions and feelings. But we live in a world which forces us to experience the world exclusively through a representation of it, which denies us the reality of the thing in itself directly through our consciousness of it. This denial automatically excludes quality. It's no good waking up or seeing the truth or taking the red pill by learning new facts or by seeing or feeling things differently. You can learn how the world really works. You can embrace alternative beliefs and lifestyles. You can read radical books and remain exactly as anxious, mediocre, selfish and brainwashed as you were to start with. You're still living on the screen of your life. Just now you're wearing a different outfit or playing a different part. This is one reason why it's so hard to get through to worldly people. It's not just that you're arguing against their beliefs and opinions, but against their being. Let me use the image that Colin Wilson uses. Imagine a prison which was impossible to escape from. Not just because its walls were 20 metres high and its locks impossible to crack, but because it covered the whole planet. It would be very difficult to even imagine escape, let alone try to. Difficult, but not impossible. The only way to make it impossible to even imagine escape would be to hypnotise the prisoners so that they believed they were the prison. Then the idea that they should escape would strike them as laughable, insane. Escape from what? Escape from my own self? Conclusion. Who am I? And so we arrive at the most important question. One so important that it strikes everyone who hears it as obvious or meaningless, or cheesy, or too deep for me. We've been looking at what I am through what I am not. I'm not the world, nor am I any of the facts which constitute the world. I'm not my thoughts, nor any of my isolated impressions, nor my actions in the world, nor my emotional reactions. What does this mean? It means I am not myself. Myself is my thoughts, my emotions, my actions, and my physical sensations. There's nothing wrong with such things, but if the things of the self are all there are in my experience, there is and there can be no quality. No quality means suffering, fear, anxiety, depression, violence, anguish, hatred, shame, regret, self-disgust, and numbed boredom. The self is always afraid, always existentially miserable, because there is no meaning for it. Only consciousness is meaningful, and if I'm not conscious, if I exist as a self, then my life, my reality, the universe entire, becomes bounded by that self, a fragile machine of limited extent, existing for a limited time, in a world which is almost entirely indifferent to it. An existence which is at best a kind of diabolical game show, which exalts the winners for a few minutes before exterminating them. More often than not, it's a battlefield in hell. In order to deal with this intolerable state of affairs, self clings to things, to ideas, to people, to sensations, and to emotions. It will attach itself to anything which gives it some kind of reassurance or some kind of familiarity. Any belief, no matter how stupid, any group, no matter how perverse, and any person, no matter how unpleasant or cruel. This clinging to what I like, want and need creates what I don't like, what I don't want, and what I don't need, which, when they start to approach, creates more fear, along with all kinds of outrageous, desperate actions to try and keep them away. The unhappy, existentially terrified self is numb to quality, to life, to love, to truth. There is a deadness to it, a coldness, and yet at the same time it is anxious, watchful, always wishing or hoping or worrying, and always full of regrets. When threatened by selflessness, criticism, or anything which it doesn't like, it sneers, it mocks, or it becomes emotional, either masochistically self-indulgent or sadistically violent. But this is not who I am. And sometimes I know it. In moments of selfish suffering, when I am being brutally spiteful, or pathetically servile, or disgracefully greedy, or embarrassingly impatient, or self-indulgently sorry for myself, or emotionally demanding, in those moments I can sometimes hear myself whisper, "I'm making this up. This isn't me." So what is me? Who am I? We have seen that I am not the film. I am consciousness of the film. But if you've grown up in a world that has conditioned you to live on and as the screen, how are you to get out of that? How are you to get back to your own consciousness? Here we reach an insoluble problem. Not that it is impossible to be conscious, but it is impossible to explain how to be conscious. Because consciousness is not a thing which can be reached through knowledge or technique. The mind, remember, turns consciousness and nature into things and then reasons about those things. When it hears the truth, it instantly turns it into a thing, an opinion, by agreeing or disagreeing with it. When it realizes that, despite its excellent opinions and impressive achievements, that it is still discontent, it starts looking once again for things to understand and a reasonable way to get to happiness. But you can't get to who you are. If you follow a path to your own consciousness, you'll stay on that path. Following a path doesn't just mean using your mind to work out how to be happy. It also means listening to the physical needs of your body. It means acting in a certain way. And it means having certain kinds of emotions. Again, not that there's anything wrong with any of that, but you can't reach a selfless, genuinely lasting peace of mind, creativity, and love through these elements of yourself. Take as an example your emotions. What happens if you always do as you feel like? If you only exercise or work or make love or anything else when you feel like it? Do you end up living the kind of life you want? Or what happens when you feel anxious if you try to use your mind to deal with those problems? If you try to work out what to do in the mental activity we call worry? Or if you act on the anxiety, try to stifle it or drown it out or escape from it? Does that work? Or what about learning? Some people believe that all they have to do is acquire knowledge and they'll be okay. They'll be safe or happy or wise. Take a look at people who have spent a long time in school, the highly qualified, the clever people. Are they moral giants? Are they brilliant and wise and happy? Some people listening to this might be putting all their efforts into combating unpleasant feelings by becoming rich, successful, comfortable and safe. How's that working out for you? Others might feel like going in the opposite direction by paring down their possessions, using their rational minds to overcome their emotions and attempting to meditate their way into a state called enlightenment. How are you doing? Are you enlightened yet? Are you overflowing with love or bursting with genuine creativity? I know you like to make out that you are, but is it the truth? The truth is that although none of these things are bad or wrong in themselves, none of them lead to consciousness. Consciousness is not a state to achieve, a thing to be, or the result of any kind of study, teaching, or practice. You can learn technique, you can learn tradition, and you can learn facts. You have to learn these things, or you'll remain a stupid, useless, cultureless infant. But you can't learn to not be yourself, because learning is part of the self. Self, by itself, is only interested in itself. It's not just uninterested in selfless consciousness, it's actively threatened by it. You may have noticed this yourself when you've been completely alone, particularly in the wild or in the dark, or when you've had to creatively flow with the moment, or when the only way to deal with someone has been to unconditionally accept or love them. In such moments, you may well have found yourself terrified, lost, appalled, or violently angry for no reason. That's the self, terrified of surrendering or sacrificing itself. You don't need such extreme situations to see the self in action, though. You might even have felt it rising up while you've been listening to me. After all, I've been criticising the self and the world it created, maintains and depends on, and that usually brings up feelings of agitation, or boredom, or annoyance, which you may well have blamed on me. Self takes criticism of self as criticism of being. If I tell a child what it thinks or does or feels is stupid or selfish, its self will probably get in a strop. But if I tell the same child that I hate it, that it is unlovable, I'm not criticising its self, but its being. This is genuinely hurtful, but self cannot tell the difference. It takes challenges to its beliefs, to its self-definitions, to its taste, to its behaviour, or to its emotions as existential threats, and it reacts accordingly, usually quite shamefully. This is why selfless people are so deeply affected by cruelty, why they are so sensitive to essential lovelessness and ugliness, and yet at the same time so shockingly unconcerned about merely formal or verbal attacks, or about merely physical dangers. This is also why selfless people love free speech and radical forms of freedom. Not because selfless people believe that selves should be able to say and do anything, but because they know that telling selves what to say or do solves nothing. Selfless people know that while selves sometimes need to be violently restrained, even killed, the only solution to selfishness is a way of life that gives consciousness complete freedom. This is an appalling prospect for selfish people who are terrified of freedom and don't know what to do with it. Selfish people might say they love freedom, but their freedom always seems to amount to laying down a load of laws, manipulating other people to do what they want, or living in institutions which make freedom impossible. Selfish people are usually numb to essential quality, but they are almost outrageously reactive. As Fyodor Dostoevsky taught us, the man who lies to himself can be more easily offended than anyone, by which he means the man who listens to himself. So don't listen to yourself. If you followed me until now, you may have been, at various points, conscious of something you've not been conscious of before, the world and the self which makes it. In those moments you might have experienced something other than the world and the self. You might have realised, not as a clever philosophical idea, as something you need to learn, but as an actual experience, that you are not the world. More amazingly, that you're not yourself. This may have been uncomfortable to yourself, but something else recognises it, which then gives encouragement to that something else, courage or confidence to live differently, even if only slightly. What I mean is that when you listen to the truth, it makes you more conscious than you were before you start listening to it. Not by practicing anything, or by following a teaching, or by getting some kind of wisdom. Not by doing or thinking anything. Just by listening to the truth. It is good to listen to the truth. It is good to be conscious. It is good to love nature and to be part of a living culture, and it is good to do useful work. And all of this makes you more conscious. There is no limit to how conscious you can be, or how much quality you can be conscious of. Sooner or later, though, that consciousness will run up against the world. And then your mind will tell you that you have a difficult decision to make. But your mind is wrong. There is no decision to make. There is no decision to make because the world isn't making it and the self isn't making it. I am making it. Not the voice you can hear in your head. That's not I. That's the voice of someone else. I'm talking about the I listening to the voice in your head. The voice in your head is terrified of surrendering itself to that which is listening to it. It will bow down before a rational system. It will bow down before an irrational tyrant. It will bow down to the devil himself, just as long as it, the voice, can keep on talking, keep on believing, keep on hoping, keep on wanting, keep on worrying, and keep on giving its opinions. In the end, though, it has to listen. Because in the end, the self, every self, dies. Then the voice stops speaking.